Hi, yeah, my name is Richard Whitmore, and I'm blessed to have been part of Maine for over half century. And I had the opportunity to be able to find out what Portland was all about in my early years. My mother and father both came from Portland. My mother was from an Irish immigrant family of 9, and they lived on Munjoy Hill, 141 Congress. My father was from an Irish Nova Scotian background, and he had 5 siblings, and he lived on Emery Street in Portland. My father was a good athlete in high school. He played at Cheverus. He played on a 1930 state championship team, and he went to Fordham University in New York after going to prep school at Coburn Classical in Waterville. When he was at Fordham, he played football and was very successful. In fact, played on the same team with Vince Lombardi, who later had great fame as coach of the Green Bay Packers. Fordham at that time was an extremely successful college team. They played at the Polo Grounds in New York City, and in one of the games, which he pointed out to me in his yearbook, they had over 60,000 people watching the Fordham Rams play. My mother was also athletic. She was went to Portland High School, and at that time, girls basketball wasn't a big thing, except she made it a big thing, and they were playing 6-on-6 half court, and she became a very, very successful person. And as the clipping she showed me later on, she was a very, very high scorer for that team, and she was very proud of her accomplishments. My father came back to Maine after Fordham, and he coached at Cheverus High School for 7 years. He coached football, basketball, and baseball. And on his first basketball team was Lachlan Jennings. Lachlan Jennings was a brother to my mother, Mary, and that's how they met. And in 1939, Cheverus won the Western Maine tournament, but lost in the state final to Winslow. And the following year, in 1940, Cheverus won the state title, and my uncle Laughlin was an important part of that team. And from that point on, there was a finalization of a romance, and they were married in 1940. And I was born in 1943 in Portland, and spent the first few years of my life in Portland. And then my mother became ill, and the best treatment for her was in Boston. So my father moved to Boston, and he coached at Danvers High School, just outside of Boston. And then in 1949 moved to Weymouth High School, which is just outside of Boston. And he coached basketball and assisted in football. Weymouth was a powerhouse athletic school at the time. They won 50-something games in football, and were a storied group, because they were the first Massachusetts team to go and participate in a National High School Bowl game in Florida. Also during the course of that time, my father coached basketball, and he became one of the, I think, only 2 coaches to ever win state basketball championships in 2 states, because he won the state championship in Massachusetts in 1953. As I grew up in Braintree, which was next to Weymouth, and the key person in my development as far as sports is concerned on an ongoing basis was my mother, because she was very, very interested in me being able to be as accomplished as I possibly could in sports, and she worked a lot with me. And it was very, very good for her, because she was in kind of a 5-year recovery program. And so she became kind of the day-to-day person in my life athletically. And the basic reason for that was because my father was a teacher and a coach, and he also worked a second job. And in fact, for 9 months out of the year, he worked from 7 o'clock in the morning until midnight. And that was a very challenging experience for all of us. I had 2 siblings, a brother and a sister. And what brought the first real memories of Maine and Portland to me was because of my mother's illness. My sister and I came to Portland to spend summers with my mother's parents on Munjoy Hill, and therefore the earliest connections that I had with sports were learning how to throw the ball and catch the ball off the side of the wall at 141 Congress, and then being able to move up in ranks and go to the Eastern Promenade and get a chance to be part of competition and sports that were going on at that time, which was a tremendous experience for me. It was really the first time that I ended up playing competitive basketball on the old courts at the Eastern Promenade, and that was an experience that was really significant for me. And in the course of that time, I made many friends. The combination of that kind of magnetized Portland and Maine to me. And when I went back to Braintree and continued through schooling, I was very fortunate to live in a great neighborhood. And in that neighborhood were a lot of wonderful people and good athletes. And probably no more than a quarter of a mile from my house, the Calhoun family lived. And Jim Calhoun, who later became a famous coach at the University of Connecticut, was someone that I played with, and we played against each other basketball-wise on the courts of East Braintree many times in the course of our junior high school years. Jim ended up going to Braintree High School. I went to Archbishop Williams, which was the parochial school in Braintree. And the combination of what we were able to do became really interesting, because his 9th grade year and my 8th grade year, we had a team that was really talented, and we ended up going to what they used to call the Junior High School Championship of Massachusetts. And when I was in the 8th grade, I played on the Boston Garden Court, and that was a tremendous opportunity and a tremendous feeling. And I was fortunate in high school to be able to do the same thing 3 times. And at the end of my high school career, obviously the opportunity to go to college was very important. It was important in our family. It was important for me. The first place that I was recruited extensively was at Princeton University. And Princeton was a Ivy League school, had a great reputation. A gentleman who was friendly with my father was a representative of Princeton, and he contacted the coach. The coach sent one of his assistants and watched me play as a junior, and they became interested, and they recruited me, if in fact writing letters back and forth was recruiting at that time. And in the fall of my senior year, they invited me to come down for a visit. And when they invited me to come down for a visit, it was going to be set up on a weekend where I would take the train from essentially in front of my house into Boston, and then down to New York City, and then out to Princeton. The Wednesday before that trip was scheduled, I got a call from Coach Capon at Princeton, and he said, "I'm sorry, we know you're supposed to visit this weekend, but we have just decided on another player who would be similar to your position that we're going to take, and he has decided to go early action at Princeton, and we're delighted, and we wouldn't want to bring you down in unfair circumstances, so that's what happened." And that was all a wonderful scenario. Until a few years later, I realized that the person that they had recruited at that time was Bill Bradley, who became a major star in basketball in the NBA, became a major focus in America as a senator from New Jersey, and was an absolutely wonderful guy. The next thing for me to do was to decide what would happen as far as college is concerned. And at the tech tournament, which was held at the Boston Garden, my junior year, my coach, high school coach, tapped me on the shoulder and said, there's a coach out here who wants to see you. And I walked out, and the coach at the time was a gentleman named Bob Donham. And Bob was the head coach at Bowdoin at the time, and he was a former Boston Celtic. He had played for the Celtics in the early to mid-'50s. And he was a very, very charismatic individual in that he could talk and talk and talk. And he was impressive to me at the time. And I think probably the most impressive thing was he played for the Celtics. So he said, come up and see Bowdoin. So in the fall, I went up and saw Bowdoin after my Princeton downer. And it was good. Bowdoin was a great school. And my mother was happy that I was interested in the school in Maine. My father was worried about paying for the tuition, but things worked out. And I matriculated at Bowdoin in the fall of 1961. And at that time, there were 800 men at Bowdoin, and it was a differential experience from what I had ever been through. It was a total fraternity school at the time. In my class of 206, I believe, was the starting number. By Sunday morning, 204 of the 206 had pledged to fraternities, and throughout the course of the next 4 years, you spent most of the time within that fraternity structure, and it was a very, very interesting thing for me. The basketball side of it at Bowdoin was very interesting. At that time, as a freshman, you could not play varsity, and that meant that you practiced as a group of freshmen by yourselves on the team. And I had, I had good experience and played a lot, and so when I went out and played with the returning players on afternoon scrimmages in the fall, it was really a good experience for me to meet more physical, older, and talented players. And one day when we were scrimmaging, I turned to go to the basket. I went to the basket, and all of a sudden I had a firm shoulder and elbow come into the side of my head that simply said, "You're not going to the basket right here." And I reacted, and I stood up, and the guy who had made contact with me at that time was Bill Cohen. Bill was a senior at Bowdoin at the time. He was captain of the team. He had been a very, very successful player at Bangor, and was really a tough physical player. And that was the first time we had essentially really met, and he and I had a pretty good relationship after that. But he was the first real athletic connection that I had with Bowdoin as far as the sports at the college are concerned. As I came to the end of my college career, which was a fairly successful one, each year we did something good in basketball, and I really enjoyed what was happening, and I really enjoyed the totality of what Bowdoin College was. I was blessed to be able to have a tremendous academic mentor, Professor Nathan Dane, who was the head of the classics department at Bowdoin, and I ended up majoring in classics. And the guy who convinced me to major in classics was Bill Cohen, because he was also a classics major at the time. And as a senior, I began to think about what I wanted to do, and I took some looks at some different opportunities, had a couple of job offers basically through other Bowdoin seniors that had dads that were involved in businesses, and thought that I would end up going back to Boston. And then in late May, I got invited to go up to Augusta to participate in a student exchange program where we would go up and talk about going to college in Maine and what it meant to go to college in Maine. And at that event, I was introduced to a woman whose name was Margaret Arbor. And Margaret Arbor was the director of teacher placement in the state of Maine. And when I met her, she said, I want to meet you because I saw your name on the list of people who are going to be here. And she said, I hired your father for his first job in 1938. And I was, again, that was something that was obviously meaningful to me. And we went on and talked a little bit, and she said, what are you majoring in? And I said, I'm majoring in classics with Latin as a designate. And she said, okay. And then I got a note on my door 2 mornings later that says, call Mrs. Arbor at the State Department of Education. So I called her up and said, and she said, well, my husband teaches at Halldale High School, and at Halldale High School they have a need for a Latin teacher and a basketball coach. And so I sat there and thought a little bit, and I said, really? And I hadn't thought a whole lot about that particular aspect of what opportunity might bring. And she said, well, come up and talk to us. And so I went up to Halldale and had a chance to meet with the principal, whose name was Fran Parker at the time, who had been a great football player and was a superb human being. And I met, at that point, the next significant mentor to me in my lifetime. And he really convinced me that this was going to be a great deal. And so I ended up teaching and coaching at Halldale, and had the chance to be able to find out what a coach was all about, and had great fun and great joy in learning the experience. It was exasperating to a point that we didn't win as much the first year as I thought we should, but we became better. We qualified for the tournament our third year. And at that point in time, I was still playing a lot of basketball myself during the course of the winter. And part of that basketball was that I would play for several teams. I would play for an Augusta area all-star team, and that's where I had a chance to meet Bob Brown, who's become one of the dear friends in my life and certainly a great mentor. And we played together and had a lot of fun, but I also played on a team out of Portland for my cousin, whose name was Eddie Griffin. And Eddie was a sports entrepreneur of major significance in Portland for over 3 decades, and he was my second cousin. And he became kind of the guru for me in a lot of ways, in that he said we're gonna be able to do a lot of things in basketball. So he kept me playing basketball. And one of the guys on the team was a guy named Brud Stover, and Brud had played basketball at Morse High School and had gone to Bowdoin and he was the all-time leading scorer for a long time. And he was a devotee to Morse High School. And as I continued to be able to play and have more success as a coach, the job at Morse High School became open in the spring of 1968. And in the spring of 1968, Brud Stover called me, brought me down, took me directly to the house of the superintendent of schools, who was Clifford Tinkham at the time, and he said, this is the guy we want to have as our head coach. So then for 2 years, I was a teacher and coach at Morse High School. And Morse had great success. They had won championships. They had Gene Hunter, who was a tremendous coach in the state of Maine for many years, was the legend at the time, and I was able to use him as a tutor as far as learning more about Bath and Morse High School. And Clyde Hayden had been the coach who preceded me, and he had had some great success. He had won a state title at Morse, had Joe Harrington, who was one of the great players in the history of the state of Maine. but he had run into a lack of success later on and had some problems with the community. And so they hired me, and when they hired me, I was very energetic, I was very involved, and we had a team that was made up of a wonderful core of young people who hadn't been used to winning, but were very, very interested in working hard. And so we came in and we kind of struggled our way through. We ended up with a record of 9-9, and we were the 8th seed going into the 1969 Western Maine Class L tournament at the Expo. So we played the first game at the Expo, and it was the first experience I had had really at the Expo other than playing there in semi-pro. And it was really exciting because the people in Bath were really involved, and we were seated 8th, and we played Thornton, who was seated 1st. And that was one of those special nights that you have as a coach, because everything worked. Everything that we did against Thornton, and they had a wonderful team, worked. And we're sitting there in the middle of the third period, and we're up by 17 or 18 points. And I'm thinking, boy, if you don't screw this up, we're gonna create a very, very important situation. And sitting in the bleachers, because you used to sit at the end of the courts at that time, I look back, and sitting in the bleachers was somebody who I kind of recognized but couldn't really focus on. We ended up winning the game, and everybody was just absolutely happy. And in the process of leaving the court, the gentleman that had been in the stands walked on to me. He says, "I'm John Winkin, and I coached against you when you were," he used to coach the freshman basketball team at Colby, "and I'm down here recruiting one of the Thornton basketball players to play baseball at Colby." And he said, "I thought your team played very well." And I thanked him, and I never thought about it again. In the first week, ended up the first week in August, I took the job at Colby in 1970, and ended up at Colby for 41 years. And when I went to Colby, John Winkin became an important mentor to me, and he was a very, very powerful presence. He wasn't a very tall man physically, but he was a very powerful presence, and he would give me advice on a constant basis. And as I was leaving, having gone through the signing of contracts with the people in the Colby offices, he said to me, "By the way," he said, "you are going to have an assistant with you who has been here already." And I said, "What?" Because I thought I was going to have the freedom to hire an assistant. And he said, "No, John Mitchell has worked with our football, basketball, and baseball teams the last 3 years, and he's going to be your assistant in basketball." And I didn't know who John Mitchell was to any great extent, and I called my father because he was an important part of the whole decision-making process. And I said, "Dad, Mr. Winkin says that I'm going to have John Mitchell as a coach." And he said, "Johnny Mitchell?" And I said, "Yeah." And he said, "Do you know that he's the greatest basketball player to ever come out of the state of Maine?" And I said, "Really?" And I had no working knowledge of that. And then my father kind of recreated the connection that he'd had with John, which was that he was coaching at Cheverus when Waterville began an incredible streak of basketball success in 1943. And my dad was coaching at Cheverus, and Cheverus beat them in 1943, and Waterville never lost another game. They won 67 straight games, including the New England High School basketball tournament, and therefore that kind of gave me an entree to John. And I went up and I met with John, and he wasn't too sure about me. Here I was, a young guy, and he was at that time he was essentially 15 years, 16 years older than I am, and he didn't really know what I knew, and so we kind of talked about things, and he was the freshman coach But in September of 1970, the NCAA proposed to have freshmen no longer be ineligible to play at the varsity level. And the 70-71 season had a freshman season, but the next year it didn't. And so therefore, I said, the one thing I want is I want you to be on the bench with me all the time. And it worked out so well that every game that that was possible, he was on the bench for over 900 games with me at Colby. And that created an amazing opportunity to get to know John, his family, his wife Pernella, who is one of the most significant people in our lives, in our family's lives. And we became wonderful friends, and I got to know the Mitchell family, and nobody ever mentioned to me about George Mitchell, but George was obviously, at that time, a person of significance and rose to be one of the great people in the history of the state of Maine. But John Mitchell became my dearest friend, and in becoming my dearest friend, he became a confidant. He became the person I depended on, and we kind of articulated a family type of atmosphere that we wanted, and it wasn't easy. And the first year was going not great, and then on a Wednesday night, we took a trip to play the University of Maine. And when we went up to the University of Maine had been very, very successful in the Yankee Conference season that year. And we played them really pretty well at home, but had lost. And we went up and played them up at Orono, and it was one of those games where everything went absolutely perfectly as far as our end is concerned, and we beat the University of Maine. And what that became was, it became kind of the hallmark game for my time at Colby as basketball coach, because at that point in time, the players started to really believe in that which we were doing. And that kind of continued and mushroomed and grew. The next thing of significance that happened was that when I was at Halldale, the final year that I was there, there was a freshman player who was playing, whose name was Brad Moore. And Brad Moore was a wonderful player as a freshman. He became one of the few players, I think, to play freshman JV and varsity in 1 year, and was a terrific player. He was 6'5", but played as if he was 6'8", and was terrific. And Halldale won the state championship in, I think it was Class B at the time, and the Class B championship was played at Colby. And I recruited Brad very hard, and he decided to come to Colby, and he was part of the real renaissance that we had as far as Colby athletics are concerned. So at that point in time, I'm sitting there and not realizing that I was one of the most blessed individuals that could be, and I had a chance over the course of the next 50 years or 45 years at the time to really look and look at an amazing sports renaissance in Maine. And I didn't know or realize that Title IX was going to come in 1973, that girls' sports and women's sports were going to be of a tremendous growth pattern. And I was locked in on trying to become the best possible coach I could be. And what came up in 1974 was an opportunity to become part owner of a basketball camp that was being conducted at Thomas College, which became known as the Pine Tree Basketball Clinic, and got a chance to meet on a special basis with Dick Meter, who had been a great high school player at Solon Academy, had been the best player in the history of the University of Maine at Farmington at the time, and was the present coach at Thomas College. So he and I evolved a camp situation that became very, very successful, and that became an important part of my life, an important part of my family's life, because my family was always involved in the goings-on of the basketball clinic. And over the course of the next 38 years, we had a chance to be able to service over 50,000 Maine basketball players, or players who were interested in basketball, and it became an absolutely wonderful experiential thing for me. Funny things that occurred during the course of the first year that I was director of athletics at Colby was I had a coach come into my office, and she said, "I have a complaint, and it's a very significant complaint, okay? I go from my office to the pool, I go from my office to the field house, I am working hard trying to get things done, and every weekday that I go down in the afternoon, I have to avoid this young man on a skateboard who is skateboarding around all of the stairwells, all of the corridors, all of the open area of the field house." And I said, "Oh, really?" And that young man who was doing it was the son of our men's track coach at the time, Jim Westcott. His name was Seth Westcott. Seth was an absolutely amazing presence, because I would sit there and admire sometimes. I mean, he could go around the track in our field house on his skateboard at a speed that was just unfathomable to me. And so I didn't necessarily want to mention that to his dad. So one of the times that I was down, and he was actually, we met on the stairwell, because he was kind of running his skateboard down the stairs from the top to the bottom. And I said, "Seth, I don't want to see you hurt. You know, you just got to," and I said, "All I ask is one thing. If there is ever anybody in your sight, can you please just make sure you avoid them and don't cause any consternation?" And he was absolutely great. He said, "Nope," he says, "I'll stay out of people's way." And I don't know really if he ever did, but all I know is that 20 plus years later, when I'm sitting there on TV and I'm watching Seth Westcott snowboard to an Olympic gold medal, that what a picture that had to be for me, because of my total memory of him being that young man that was skateboarding throughout the athletic complex at Colby. So that kind of put a little bit of a picture of what went on for me for the next 2 decades, because I was director of athletics at Colby, I was men's basketball coach at Colby, and I was director of the basketball camp. And so I really didn't have a whole lot of free time, but as I say many times to people, nobody in the world had more fun than I did in the course of my professional lifetime. And I just enjoyed every possible minute of it. And the big thing was the growing family of Colby basketball players that I had a chance to be able to be part of their lives. And it became important as we began to develop a larger alumni group, and from the 70s to the 80s to the 90s, there really is an amazing group of men who still connect very strongly to Colby men's basketball. And with the technology that exists today, there isn't a day go by. I heard from one of them on my way in here today. And it certainly has energized me. It has continued to energize me as time has gone by, and I have no greater love for anything other than my own family than for the Kobe basketball family that exists. And it has been an absolutely tremendous connection of opportunities that has allowed me to be able to be part of sport in Maine, to have a chance to watch the growth of things happening in Maine. And as I lived through the experience, the number of things that happened to me are very difficult to try to portray in the right perspective. And the big thing is that there never was a day that I went to be part of my work existence that I didn't just simply love the challenge of. And along the lines, what happened in 2011 is that I joined the board of the Maine Sports Hall of Fame. And when I joined the Maine Sports Hall of Fame board, I became energized with the purpose and that which they were doing. And from that point on, I became actively part of their process of selection, their process of awarding scholarships, their process of creating opportunities to help people through sport, and exist with the organization. I'm now one of the head people at the Maine Sports Hall of Fame, and through that I have had a chance to do three things. Number one, I've had a chance to meet fantastic people. I've had a chance to be able to trace sports and people in sports over the course of the last more than half century. And as an individual, I have had a chance. I've had a chance to really be able to thoroughly research almost every sport in Maine, and have learned so much that I could never really express how important it's been for me as far as fulfillment and activity. And so what has happened over the course of time is that the road to irrelevance that I had worried so significantly about in the course of getting to the early stages of my retirement has kind of circled itself, so that I now work anywhere between 60 and 70 hours a week, enjoy every second of it, and have had an immense opportunity to develop relationships and to develop connections with people that I would never have thought possible. And I'm, as I said in the beginning, I'm a very blessed and totally humbled person by all the people that I've met within my time in Maine. Maine sport and what Maine has done for me could never be more, and I could never have asked for a better experience.